Silas Blackwood had come to the Barty Ranch for a horse, a powerful dark bay with a reputation that had reached 3 territories. But the woman standing alone by the corral fence was not what he expected to find in the heat shimmer of a Nevada summer. She was small, dressed in a tattered gray prairie dress that hung on her frame, her black hair pulled back in a severe knot. She wasn't looking at him or the dust his gelding kicked up. Her gaze was fixed on the very horse he'd come to see, an animal that stood with its head lowered over the top rail, nuzzling her still hand. The ranch house was a sorry sight, a clapboard structure bleached to the color of bone by the relentless sun. A man came out onto the porch, wiping his hands on his trousers. He was thin and weathered, with the kind of perpetual worry etched into his face that came from fighting a losing battle against dry soil and bad luck. This had to be Jedediah Croft. "You Blackwood!" Croft called out, his voice thin and reedy. Silas swung down from his saddle, the leather creaking in the quiet. "I am. Came to see about the horse you advertised." Croft's eyes flickered toward the woman at the fence, a motion of pure irritation. "He's a fine animal. Best I ever bred." He walked down the steps, deliberately ignoring her as he passed. "Got the spirit of the devil in him, but he'll run till his heart gives out." "You want to look?" Silas nodded, his attention divided between the magnificent horse and the silent figure beside it. The bay was everything the advertisement promised, deep-chested, with powerful hindquarters and an intelligent eye. But it was the way the horse stood for the woman, gentle as a lamb, that held his notice. When Croft approached, the horse's ears flattened, and a low rumble started in its chest. "He's skittish with strangers," Croft said quickly, waving a dismissive hand. "Pay it no mind." "He doesn't seem skittish with her," Silas observed, his voice level. Croft spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. She's part of the trouble." Came with it. He lowered his voice, as if sharing a dirty secret. "My boy, Samuel, he was supposed to take her? A deal made with her father, one of the foremen from the railroad. A bargain for some hands and a right-of-way. Samuel, he took one look and lit out for California 2 months back. Left me with the whole mess." Silas looked back at the woman. She hadn't moved, hadn't acknowledged their presence. She just kept her hand resting on the horse's muzzle, a small, still point in a world of shimmering heat and dust. Abandoned. The word settled in Silas's mind, heavy and unpleasant. "What's to become of her?" he asked, the question leaving his lips before he could stop it. It wasn't his business. He was here for a horse, a transaction, and then he'd be gone. Croft shrugged, a gesture of profound indifference. "Ain't my concern. Sent word to a man in Carson City who runs a boarding house. He'll take her off my hands next week." He said boarding house with a particular sneer that left no doubt as to the nature of the establishment. The coldness in the man's tone was more brutal than a physical blow. Silas felt something tighten in his gut. He had seen the world's casual cruelty in many forms, but the calm, practical way Croft spoke of selling a human being like livestock was something else. He turned his attention back to the business at hand, forcing the cold anger down. "Let's talk price for the horse." $300, Croft said, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of greed and desperation. "Gold coin. For an animal like that, it's a steal." It was high, but not unfair. Silas had the money, hard-earned and carefully guarded. He was about to counter when the woman finally moved. She turned from the horse and began walking toward a small, dilapidated shack set away from the main house. She walked with her head held high, her back straight, a silent rebuke to the world that had cast her aside. The horse whinnied softly, watching her go. That sound, a soft note of distress, decided it for him. "I'll need to see him ridden," Silas said. "He's a one-man horse," Croft warned. "Bucked off every hand I got." "Then you ride him," Silas replied, his gaze steady. A flicker of fear crossed Croft's face before he masked it. "Fine. I'll saddle him up." But as Croft entered the corral, the bay's entire demeanor changed. It became a whirlwind of teeth and hooves, ears pinned back, driving the rancher against the fence. Croft scrambled back through the rails, cursing. See? Devil horse, he spat, rubbing his shoulder. But once you break him, he'll be worth it. Silas looked from the furious horse to the quiet shack where the woman had disappeared. He had come for a simple purchase, a clean transaction that would see him on his way before sundown. But the sight of that woman, the sound of the horse's lonely call, and the sour taste of Croft's cruelty had tangled the whole business into something else entirely. He was a man who valued simplicity, who had built a life on clear lines and uncomplicated dealings. What was happening here was the opposite of that. Yet, turning his back felt like a kind of defeat he wasn't willing to accept. He did not yet know that the horse was the only honest thing on this ranch, and it belonged to the one person nobody saw. The dust of a second arrival announced itself before the riders were visible. 3 men on horseback crested the low rise, moving with the lazy entitlement of men who believed the land and everything on it belonged to them. The man in the lead was broad-shouldered, with a florid face and a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. Croft's posture changed instantly. The bluster drained out of him, replaced by a nervous deference. "Bo," he said, his voice strained. "Wasn't expecting you." "Just checking on my investment, Jedediah," the man named Bo Garrett said, his voice a low drawl. He swung down from his horse, his gaze sweeping over the ranch with open contempt before it landed on Silas. "Got a buyer for the bay?" "Just looking," Croft stammered. Garrett's eyes then found the shack, and his smile widened. "And how's our little China doll?" "Still sulking." He started walking toward the shack, his spurs ringing with menace. Before Silas could move, the door of the shack opened. The woman stepped out. She stood on the single wooden step, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression unreadable. "Leave her be, Bo," Croft said, but there was no force in his words. Garrett just laughed. "You owe me, Jedediah. That water right you promised, that pasture land. Your boy running off doesn't cancel the debt." He took another step toward her. "Maybe she can work it off." One of Garrett's men snickered. The air grew thick and still. This was the moment Silas had been trying to avoid, the messy, violent tipping point of other people's bad decisions. He could mount his gelding and ride away. It was not his fight. He had his own money, his own plans. But his feet felt rooted to the dusty ground. He thought of the way the horse gentled for her, the way she walked with her head held high. He took a slow step forward, placing himself between Garrett and the path to the shack. "The man's trying to conduct business," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying in the silence. "Seems you're interrupting." Garrett stopped. He turned his head slowly, sizing Silas up. He saw a dusty drifter with a worn gun belt. He didn't see the name that went with the man. "And who are you?" "A customer," Silas said. "Well, customer," Garrett sneered, "this is a private matter. Best you move along before you get your boots dirty." It was then that the woman spoke. Her voice was clear and low, without a trace of the accent they all expected. "Mr. Garrett, your business is with Mr. Croft. It does not concern me." The sound of her perfect English struck the men like a physical blow. Garrett's sneer faltered for a second. He had assumed she was a frightened, ignorant creature he could easily intimidate. This calm, articulate woman was something else. It made him angrier. "It concerns you when you're living on land that's owed to me," he shot back. "The land I reside on was part of an agreement with my father," she stated, her chin lifting slightly. "A piece of paper signed by a dead man don't mean much out here," Garrett said, recovering his swagger. He gestured to one of his men. "Go on. Remind her of her place." The man, a lanky youth with a cruel mouth, started forward. The bay horse in the corral suddenly kicked the fence with a sound like a gunshot, sensing the threat. The man flinched. And in that moment of distraction, Silas moved. He didn't draw his pistol. He simply closed the distance in 2 quick strides and caught the man's outstretched arm, twisting it behind his back with an efficient, brutal motion that brought a yelp of pain. "I believe the lady asked you to leave," Silas said, his voice still level, but now with an edge of tempered steel. He pushed the man back toward Garrett, sending him stumbling into his boss. Garrett's face turned a deep, mottled red. His hand hovered over the butt of his pistol. "You just made a mistake, friend." "No," Silas said, his hand now resting loosely near his own weapon. "The mistake was thinking a man's character is measured by the dust on his coat. Now, you and your men are going to get on your horses and ride out. The business here is concluded." For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the hot wind and the nervous stamping of the horses. Garrett stared at Silas, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He had built his power on bullying men like Croft. This man was different. There was a stillness about him, a lack of fear that was more intimidating than any threat. Finally, Garrett gave a curt nod to his men. "This ain't over," he snarled, his eyes locking onto the woman. "That horse, that land, and everything on it, will be mine, Croft. One way or another." They mounted up and rode away, leaving a cloud of angry dust in their wake. Croft looked pale and shaken. He stared at Silas, then at the woman, as if seeing them both for the first time. The simple horse sale had just become something far more dangerous, and Silas was standing right in the middle of it. After the dust settled, an uneasy quiet fell over the ranch. Croft scurried back into his house, slamming the door behind him. He wanted no part of what had just happened. Silas was left standing in the yard, the afternoon sun beating down on him. He turned to the woman, who was still standing on the step of her shack. "You ought to be careful," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Men like Garrett don't make idle threats." She met his gaze directly. "I am aware. Thank you for your intervention." She gave a slight, formal bow of her head. "My name is Leanne. Silas Blackwood." She nodded, as if the name meant something to her. "The horse you admire?" "His name is Hafing." She walked down the step and toward the corral. The big bay trotted to the fence to meet her, nudging her shoulder. "He was a gift from my father." There was a finality in her tone that made it clear. The horse was hers. Not Croft's to sell. Everything the rancher had said was a lie, built on the assumption that she had no voice and no rights. "Croft told me a different story," Silas said, following her to the fence. "Mr. Croft is a man who believes a story becomes true if he tells it often enough," Leanne said, stroking the horse's neck. "He is a weak man, and weak men are often the most dangerous. They invite predators like Mr. Garrett." She was right. Silas had seen it 100 times. He leaned against the sun-warmed wood of the corral, watching her. There was a strength in her that her worn dress and slender frame concealed. It was in the clarity of her speech, the steadiness of her hands, the directness of her gaze. "My father was a work foreman for the Central Pacific," she explained, her eyes on the distant horizon. "He was respected. He negotiated a contract with Mr. Croft for a parcel of this land, the section with the artesian spring, in exchange for securing a reliable labor crew for 2 seasons. The land was to be my dowry. My marriage to his son was to seal the arrangement." She reached into a small pocket sewn into the seam of her dress and pulled out a folded, oilskin wrap packet. She carefully unfolded it. It was a document, written in both English and what Silas assumed were Chinese characters. At the bottom were 2 signatures, Jedediah Croft's sprawling, messy script, and another, a set of elegant, precise characters. "This is the deed agreement," she said, holding it out to him. "Witnessed by the circuit judge. My father was a meticulous man. He did not trust a handshake alone." Silas took the document. It was exactly what she said it was. A legal, binding claim to 160 acres of the Bartee, including the only reliable water source for miles. Croft hadn't just been trying to get rid of a social inconvenience, he was actively trying to steal her inheritance. Samuel's disappearance had been a convenient pretext. "Garrett wants the water," Silas said, the pieces clicking into place. "With it, he could control this whole valley." "Yes," Leanne confirmed. "He has been pressuring Mr. Croft to sell for months. When my father died of a fever a month after signing this, Mr. Croft thought his problem was solved. he thought I was an ignorant girl who would not understand the paper I held. She had been playing a long, dangerous game. Waiting, observing, surviving in a place where she was utterly alone, holding on to the one thing her father had left her. Her quietness wasn't passivity, it was a shield. A new sound reached them, the rattle of a wagon. A single rider accompanied it. The rider wore a dusty badge on his vest. A territorial marshal. For a fleeting moment, Silas felt a sense of relief. But the way the marshal ignored them and went straight to Croft's porch, where Garrett was suddenly waiting, told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't help arriving. This was the trap closing. Garrett, Croft, and the marshal spoke in low, urgent tones. Then, the marshal detached himself and walked toward them, a piece of paper in his hand. Garrett watched from the porch, a triumphant smirk on his face. The marshal said, stopping a few feet away. He didn't look at Silas. I have a notice here for you to vacate these premises. You're squatting on Mr. Croft's property. I am not squatting, Leanne said, her voice betraying no fear. I have a legal deed to this parcel. The marshal waved the paper. This is an official eviction order from the county magistrate. Says any prior agreements are null and void due to breach of contract. You have until sundown tomorrow to be gone. It was a lie, a legal document twisted into a weapon by a corrupt official in Garrett's pocket. Sundown tomorrow. It wasn't enough time to get to the territorial capital, not enough time to find an honest judge. It was a checkmate. Silas looked at Leanne. Her face was pale, but her spine was rigid. He looked at Hafen, the horse he had traveled 100 miles to buy. He looked at Garrett, whose smug expression was an insult to justice itself. He had a choice. A simple one. He could tip his hat, wish the lady luck, and ride away. He would be free of this trouble, his money safe in his pocket. No one would blame him. It was not his fight. Or he could stay. He could buy into a fight that was all but lost, against a man who owned the local law and a community that would see him as nothing but a troublemaking drifter. It was a fool's choice. He made it. Marshal, Silas said, stepping forward. I believe there's been a misunderstanding. He turned to Leanne. You said the horse is yours. Is he for sale? Leanne looked at him, her dark eyes searching his. She saw something there, a quiet resolve that went beyond pity. She gave a single, sharp nod. He is. What's your price? Silas asked. $300, she said, her voice clear and strong. Silas unbuttoned his bag, pulled out a heavy leather pouch, and counted out the gold coins into her hand, right there in front of the marshal and Garrett. The clink of the coins was the only sound. Marshal, Silas said, turning back to the lawman. I've just purchased this horse from Miss Leanne, who is the legal landowner according to a deed I have personally inspected. I'll be staying here as her guest to ensure her property rights are respected. If Mr. Garrett has an issue, he can file a claim with the U.S. Marshal's office in Carson City. I'll be sending them a telegraph in the morning to inform them of the situation. The territorial marshal's face went slack with surprise. Garrett's smirk vanished, replaced by a dark scowl. Silas had just called their bluff, and in doing so, had tied his fate to Leanne's. He hadn't just bought a horse. He had bought a war. 3 months later, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the valley. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth. The dilapidated shack was gone, replaced by a small, sturdy cabin built from cartonwood and stone, with glass in the windows and a porch that faced the sunrise. The bar T sign was gone, too. In its place, a newly painted sign read Hafen Ranch. Leanne came out of the cabin, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. She handed one to Silas, who was leaning against the new corral fence, the same spot where he had first seen her. Inside the corral, Hafen stood with a fine-looking mare, the first of what they hoped would be many. The telegraph to the U.S. Marshal had worked better than Silas had dared hope. The federal office had been looking for a reason to investigate Garrett and his pet magistrate for some time. Faced with a signed deposition from Silas Blackwood, a name that carried more weight in those offices than Garrett had anticipated, they had sent a deputy marshal who was immune to bribes. The fraudulent eviction order was thrown out. Leanne's deed was officially recorded. Garrett was now entangled in a legal battle that was draining his resources and his power, and the corrupt territorial marshal had been stripped of his badge. Jedediah Croft, seeing his protector weakened, had sold his remaining land for pennies on the dollar and disappeared. Leanne had proven to be as shrewd in business as she was resilient in spirit. She managed the ranch's finances with the same meticulous care her father had managed his work crews. Silas handled the horses and the physical labor, finding a surprising peace in the rhythm of the work. The reputation that had followed him for years, the shadow of the gunslinger, seemed to fade a little more each day, replaced by the simple identity of a man who worked a piece of land. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the horses. It was a partnership built not on grand declarations, but on shared labor, mutual respect, and the quiet understanding of two people who had found an anchor in a drifting world. "He is a good horse," Leanne said softly, her gaze on the dark bay. "He's the reason I came here," Silas replied, taking a sip of the hot coffee. Leanne looked at him, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time. "Is he the reason you stayed?" Silas looked out at the land, their land, carved out of dust and defiance. He thought of the long, lonely years of riding from one town to the next, always moving, never planting roots. He had come here seeking a fast horse to carry him away, and instead, he had found the one place on earth that made him want to stop riding. "No," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "No, he wasn't. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.